All right, let's dive right into this explainer covering the second cycle of speeches in the book of Job. This is the exact moment where ancient wisdom literature suddenly turns into a high-stakes, cutthroat legal drama. Seriously, if you thought the first round of dialogues was intense, you're going to want to buckle up for this. The friendly comfort we saw earlier, yeah, that has completely vanished, and it's been replaced by cold, hard accusations. Today, we're looking at chapters 15 through 21, a section where the gloves truly come off and the emotional weight of this story hits its absolute peak.
It's a terrifying realization, isn't it? Imagine sitting in the ashes of your former life, looking at the suffering around you and within you, and suddenly realizing the cosmic scales of justice might actually be rigged, or at the very least, they aren't balanced the way everyone always told you they were. This is the profound question we're exploring today as we watch Job's worldview completely shatter. It's a moment so many of us can relate to, when that neat, tidy formula you were taught for how the world works simply crashes headfirst into reality. To make sense of this incredibly dense debate, we're going to break it down into 4 clear sections. The second cycle begins, 3 rounds of accusation, a broken system, and finally, vindication versus restoration. Okay, section 1. The second cycle begins, setting the stage. So, what starts as 3 friends trying to offer a little comfort turns into what is perhaps the worst group therapy session in recorded history. We've got Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and their whole approach quickly devolves into a rapid-fire courtroom debate where the accusations just grow increasingly severe. Dr. John Walton actually points out that the rhetoric sharply changes right here. We aren't dealing with gentle prodding or soft shoulders to cry on anymore. Job's friends are aggressively digging their heels in. And there's a really fascinating psychological reason for this. They see Job's continued suffering and his absolute refusal to just admit he did something wrong as a direct existential threat to their own understanding of how God operates. Think about it. If Job is truly innocent, their entire theology collapses. So they aren't acting like counselors anymore. They've transformed into ruthless prosecutors. Moving right along to section 2, 3 rounds of accusation, the escalating trial.
In round 1, Eliphaz comes out swinging. He does not hold back, essentially telling Job that his bluster is a public disgrace and that he's just digging a deeper hole for himself. Eliphaz demands Job recognize his guilt, arguing that God universally punishes the wicked, so Job's unparalleled misery is absolute objective proof of his sin. In his eyes, Job has entirely nullified his own piety. But Job shoots back with incredible frustration. He rightly points out that talk is incredibly cheap when you aren't the one sitting in the ashes covered in sores. Job says he feels entirely abandoned, mocked by his community, tormented by enemies, and worse, attacked by God himself. Because of this terrifying isolation, Job declares he needs a divine legal advocate, some heavenly witness to step in and defend him against these divine attacks. He is determined to stay the course of righteousness, even if the grave is literally all he has left to look forward to.
Then, in round 2, Bildad steps up and his argument is a lot briefer, but infinitely harsher. Bildad claims that God's judgment of the wicked is severe and absolute. Therefore, Job, who is obviously experiencing historic levels of judgment, must be classified as someone who fundamentally doesn't even know God. Bildad essentially tells Job to just drop the charade. Well, this prompts an explosive, heartbreaking reply from Job. He loudly and defiantly declares that he has done absolutely nothing to deserve this. He screams out that it's God who, in his inexplicable and terrifying anger, has messed up his life, stripped his honor, and made him an outcast despised by everyone he once loved. Yet, incredibly, right in the middle of this total despair, Job remains fiercely confident. He insists that just when all seems completely lost, a living defender, a redeemer, is going to arise to stand on the earth and clear his name from these terrible insinuations. By the 3rd round, Zophar enters the fray with a blunt, brutal verdict. He states that Job's stubborn self-righteousness completely betrays him, arguing that such arrogance and pride are exactly what characterizes the wicked. For Zophar, God has clearly already judged who is wicked here, so there's really nothing left to discuss. The gavel has fallen. But you have to notice Job's brilliant, shocking shift in strategy here. He completely ignores Zophar. He treats the accusation as totally irrelevant, not even dignifying it with a direct response. Instead, he turns his face upward, entirely bypassing his friends to bring a formal, high-stakes lawsuit directly against God himself. Job actually admits, "I realize that I'm risking a lot by pressing legal action against God." And man, this brilliantly illustrates the sheer desperation Job feels as he sits totally alone in his corner, willingly questioning the creator of the universe. Dr. Walton vividly describes this as Job building his fort in his corner. He fully realizes the massive existential risk of what he's doing. Calling the Almighty to account, that is a complex, almost unthinkable thing to do in ancient literature. But Job is completely out of options. His friends have turned against him, his life is in total ruins, his body is failing. And yet, he steadfastly refuses to lie about his integrity just to make things easier or to pacify his critics.
Which brings us to Section 3, A Broken System, Questioning Cosmic Justice.
So think of the retribution principle as an ancient, ironclad version of karma. It's the absolute guarantee that God consistently punishes the bad guys and consistently protects and prospers the good guys. This principle is the unshakable bedrock of his friend's entire worldview. But Job looks out at the real world and sees greedy, arrogant, violent people thriving and living comfortably to an old age. He realizes they aren't always being punished, and he reasons, logically and terrifyingly, if God doesn't consistently punish the wicked, like the formula says, couldn't we conclude that he doesn't consistently protect and prosper the righteous either? This profound realization leads Job dangerously close to entirely rejecting this foundational retribution principle. The math simply isn't mathing anymore.
So at the end of this second cycle, we reach a terrifying deadlock. The system appears totally broken. His friends have completely lost faith in him, and they now confidently categorize him alongside the most wicked people on earth. Meanwhile, Job's view of God's immediate justice is rapidly deteriorating. Yet through all of this immense pressure, Job unwaveringly insists on his own righteousness. His friends try to offer him a convenient appeasement resolution, basically begging him to just confess to some imaginary sins so God will stop hitting him. But Job fiercely rejects it. He's not going to play the game.
And that leads us to our final section. Section 4, Vindication versus Restoration. Integrity versus Material Wealth.
Let's define restoration for a second. Put simply, restoration is getting your stuff back. It's the return of your wealth, your flocks, your health, your social standing, and your comfortable status quo. Job's friends are pushing him incredibly hard toward restoration. In their neatly ordered view of the universe, Job's horrific experiences indisputably place him in the category of the wicked. So they're essentially begging him to just play along, identify with the wicked, admit fault, appease an angry deity, and get your stuff back. They think taking a plea deal is his only logical way out of this nightmare.
But vindication, that is an entirely different animal. Vindication is an official, undeniable, legal declaration that you are in the right. It is the ultimate stamp of innocence. It has absolutely nothing to do with stuff. And here's the mind-bending part of this ancient text. Job doesn't want his stuff back. He doesn't care about the sheep or the camels right now. He is pressing exclusively for vindication. He wants the undeniable official proof from God himself that he maintained his righteousness and didn't deserve this suffering. Now, his friends consider this expectation completely unrealistic, vain, and borderline suicidal. But for Job, this public validation of his innocence is absolutely everything.
This fundamental clash of values is the exact tension driving this entire courtroom drama. His friends want him to take a plea deal, sacrifice his internal integrity, admit to fake sins, and get his comfortable material life back. They value the outcome, the physical blessing, but Job defines his very existence by holding on to his integrity. He insists on vindication rather than restoration, even if it means losing absolutely everything else permanently. This stubborn, unflinching insistence is precisely what defines Job's immense, world-changing integrity throughout the text. He would literally rather die honest than live a comfortable lie.
As we wrap up this explainer, consider this for a moment. If you were in Job's shoes, staring down a broken cosmic system where doing the right thing clearly wasn't protecting you from tragedy, what would you choose? Would you offer a fake apology to the universe just to stop the pain and get your life back? Or would you sit in the ashes, risk the wrath of the divine, and lose everything just to maintain the absolute truth of your own integrity? It's a profound, haunting question that the book of Job demands we ask ourselves. Thanks for joining me today, and keep exploring these big questions.